Maybe somebody could remind me, first of all, what this word revolution means. Uprising could be an example of a revolution, right? People don't like their government, so they have a revolution against it, right? An uprising, right? To force a change. But is every revolution a violent uprising? Give me an example of a revolution we learned about this year that's not a violent overthrow of a government. The Industrial Revolution. That's not a violent uprising. It's just a major change, right? Challenging traditions. The traditional way of making things was by hand. Now we're using machines to throw that all away and do things a little bit differently. This is an example of a violent uprising. And they're going to usher in some changes. Ultimately, with France, it became a republic, right? Based on the ideas of the Enlightenment. The Russian Revolution is going to be a little bit different. They're going to become something called the Soviet Union. They're going to use communism. So I'm going to read along and stop and ask you questions as we go. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was actually two revolutions, one in March and one in November of 1917. The November Revolution is also referred to as the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay, there's going to be a lot of words thrown at you, just like always in this class. We've got to be confusing, right? So Bolshevik Revolution, Russian Revolution, it's going to be the same thing. Before the Russian Revolution, the country was ruled by a king called a Tsar, sometimes spelled C-Z-A-R, as you see, sometimes spelled T-S-A-R. And the person was Nicholas II. And we already referred to him a little bit. If you remember that telegram, right, from the Tsar to the Kaiser, Nicholas II was the guy who wrote that telegram, telling his German cousin, like, listen, bro, try to stop Austria-Hungary from declaring war because we don't want to fight alongside you. We don't want to fight against you. There was discontent, meaning dissatisfaction, in Russia because the government was corrupt and ineffective. There was widespread poverty in the country. There was a scarcity of food, and the Russians suffered massive losses in World War I. Right? If you remember, Russia left World War I midway through it, or almost towards the end, but not quite. As a result, in March of 1917, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, which means give up, and his power was given to a group of elected officials called the Duma. Okay, so people were really ticked off and told the king, you have to go away. And in its place, you get in a group of elected officials who are going to make laws. What do we call the group of elected officials in this country that makes laws? In this country? The legislative branch, right? And we have a specific name for our legislative branch, the Congress. Duma is just a Russian version of Congress. So they get rid of the king and they set up a Russian Congress. But we're not going to call it Russian Congress. We're going to call it Duma, just to be confusing. The Duma ruled until October, when it was replaced by those who would begin the November Revolution, right? So something was wrong with that group. People were not satisfied with that Duma, and they created some more change. Multiple phases, just like the French Revolution had multiple phases, right? You had a republic, you had a reign of terror, you had a Napoleon phase, all these different times. Led by a man named Vladimir Lenin, a group of communists named the Bolsheviks took control of the Russian government in a bloodless coup. C-O-U-P is pronounced coup in this context. It's a French word for overthrow. So the communists did not like that Russian Congress, led a bloodless overthrow, meaning they bursted into a government office and kicked everybody out, and there was no fighting. The Bolsheviks gained the support from the peasants, urban workers, people who worked in cities, and soldiers by promising three simple things: peace, land, and bread. As you're going to see, this Lenin guy decided if he was going to have any sort of success at leading a revolution, he needed to build a massive army and a massive number of people supporting him. Guys, always in society, if you were to look at a culture in history, do we see more rich people or more poor people? More poor people. So if you could find a way to get all those poor people on your side, if the two sides went to war against each other, rich versus poor, if the poor are well-led and well-armed, they're going to be successful. And that's what this Lenin guy did. He himself was wealthy, but he told all the poor people, listen, you don't like the fact that you got drafted and have to go fight this war against the Germans? We're going to make peace with the Germans. We're going to get out of World War I. You don't have a place to live? You're that poor? We're going to get you someplace to live. You can't afford to eat? Here's a piece of bread. Simple promises made to poor people who were desperate, got the poor people on his side. You'll see similar stuff with Hitler before World War II, promising poor, desperate Germans all these simple things to get Germans on his side. The Bolsheviks signed a peace agreement with Germany, taking Russia out of World War I. After winning a civil war that lasted for 5 years, the The Bolsheviks set out transforming Russia into the world's first communist nation. Does anyone remember anything about communism as a concept? The government runs everything. So the government doesn't just make laws. The government owns the businesses, runs the businesses, does everything. And they do that, or they try to do that for a very specific reason. What's the ultimate goal of the government when it owns and operates all these things? What are they trying to create in society? Classless society, right? Which is a way of saying everyone to be equal, right? Karl Marx said the reason why people fight with each other and the reason why there's conflict is because there's poor people who are angry at rich people. So if we can eliminate poor people and rich people, make everybody the same, we will have peace. Russia, when it becomes a communist country, is now going to be called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The acronym being USSR. Sometimes we call that the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution was like a firecracker with a very long fuse. The explosion came in 1917, yet the fuse had been burning for nearly a century. The cruel and oppressive rule of most 19th century czars caused widespread social unrest for decades. Army officers revolted in 1825. Secret revolutionary groups plotted to overthrow the government. In 1881, revolutionaries, angry over the slow pace of change, assassinated one of the czars. Usually if your president or your king is being assassinated by the people, it shows the country is not really doing so hot. Russia was heading towards a full-scale revolution, which would break out a couple of decades later. If we were to identify a year with the Russian Revolution, 1917 is your year. Put that for number one. Right smack dab in the middle of World War I, Russia says, time for a revolution. Before there was a revolution, who was the person in charge? Nicholas II. And what's the title we give him? Not king, not Kaiser, but it's a czar, it's pronounced. C-Z-A-R, sometimes you will see T-S-A-R. It's the same word. It's actually the Russian word for Caesar, going all the way back to Roman times when the Russians had some ties with Roman people. Okay, it simply means Russian word for king or emperor. Based on the reading, can somebody tell me why people rose up against the Tsar? Give me one problem referred to. Widespread poverty, right? Really, since the Enlightenment, people were thinking it's the role of the government to try to step in and help people when there's widespread poverty. That wasn't happening under the rule of the Tsars. Maybe someone could tell me another problem? Scarcity of food. There's a word we haven't seen in a while. It's an enduring issue that we've talked about. Do you remember what scarcity means? Yeah, lack of something, right? PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X. Two things that are scarce. When things are scarce, are they cheap or expensive? Very expensive, absolutely, right? You could probably, maybe, just maybe, live without a PlayStation 5. Just maybe. You cannot live without chicken nuggets, however, right? So when food becomes scarce and food becomes expensive and you don't have any money, you get desperate. Desperate people who are hungry go crazy. So, who's the person we associate with all these changes? Who's the Russian guy? Vladimir Lenin. Okay, how did Russia change after this revolution? Russia becomes USSR, parentheses, Soviet Union. What kinds of ideas do they use to run their government? Communist ideas. Used communism in the government. Their mission when they had this revolution was, let's take Karl Marx's ideas and actually put them into practice. Let's lead an uprising of the poor against the rich, and then go about making everything equal, because an equal society is a peaceful society, I suppose. Finally, that last paragraph here with that statement about a long fuse. What do you guys think the main argument the author's trying to make in that paragraph about the Russian Revolution, based on that opening sentence and these supporting details? Any ideas? Okay, right? The problems in Russia have been going on for a long time. Okay, people build up animosity over a very long period of time. So let's put that down here. The problems that led to a revolution had been building up for a long period of time. As you'll see, World War I is really the driving force behind finally making drastic changes, but people were upset for a long time. So, like we said, guys, all these little sections of the activity are talking about reasons why there was a revolution in Russia. And we said yesterday that revolution, in a basic sense, means a drastic change, right? So it could be a drastic change with technology, with the Industrial Revolution. It could be a drastic change with the government, like the American, French, Haitian, and Russian revolutions. So let's dig into some of the problems, and what you'll see is very similar to the problems that the king faced in France before his revolution. Here's a fancy word for something that we've already learned about. Can you tell me what autocracy means? One person has absolute power. We've talked about absolute power. Just to be extra, we're going to throw another word at you for it. Absolute power means the one person controls every aspect of the government. So there are no checks and balances. There's no influence of Montesquieu. There's no elections. You can't pick your czar, right? When the czar dies, the oldest son takes over. It's a very old school way of going about things. And you got to think about the time period too. We're talking 1917, right? America got rid of that in the 1770s, the French in the 1790s. You're over 100 years later and Russia is still clinging to its old school traditions and people are getting tired of it, just like they did in France. Besides that, censorship was being done here. I said it yesterday. Can someone remind me what censorship means? What the beep is the answer to that question? Oh, I just censored myself. Yeah, the government restricts your access to certain information, right? We talked about the pandemic of 1918 and how the government didn't let out the fact that so many people were getting sick and dying because they didn't want the soldiers to say, oh, you know what? I'm not going to go to do World War I because I don't want to get sick and die. So censorship does happen in every culture to a certain extent. In Russia, it was really hardcore. What did they censor in Russia for number 2 here? Censored published materials. Okay, so if something was going to be available to the public, like a newspaper, a magazine, or a radio program, right, those are published materials, the government's going to have to take a look at it first and get rid of any information that they deemed dangerous. What kind of blew my mind here, if you take a look, if you saw this, private letters were censored. So imagine you mailed a letter to somebody. Instead of it going right to that person, it goes to a government office first, like a post office, but then they open up your mail, and then any words they don't like, they just white them out or cross them out, and then they seal it back up and then send it to you. Imagine that kind of existence. Imagine that how much fear you would have to have about what was in that letter. That's not really a comfortable situation. You know, people were understandably upset about that. Number 3 is not a typo. It's not programs. The word is pogroms. What are pogroms? Organized violence against Jewish people. What I mean by organized is the government is leading it. The government is getting people together to commit crimes against Jewish people, similar to what the Nazis were doing during the Holocaust, right? It's not just like one random group of anti-Semitic people, you know, doing something sketchy. No, it's the government planning these violent attacks against Jewish communities. We'll talk about why they did that in a second, but what happened to Jewish people as a result of all this discrimination? Perfect answer. Became refugees and settled in other parts of Europe. Unfortunately, you're going to hear this word refugee a lot the rest of the school year. Refugee, I bet you wonder what that means, right? Somebody who's forced to leave their home and relocate and settle somewhere else, either because of disease being spread in an area, or a lack of a job, or war, or violence is destroying your community. Okay? Sometimes groups of people in the course of history are forced to leave and they're spread out in multiple places. An example from 9th grade that you learned about, even if your teacher didn't use the word is diaspora, and that was in the reading here, a bolded term. Diaspora is when people spread out across the planet. One you learned about last year was the African diaspora, right? African people are in Africa. Slave trade happens. What happens? African people are spread all across the planet. Some go to the colonies in North America. Some go to Haiti. Some go to South America. Some go to the Middle East. That's a diaspora. So Jewish people spread all across the world as a result of discrimination that they faced in Russia. Why did they do this? Why did Russia discriminate against Jewish communities? The answer would be the same in Nazi Germany, as we'll see. What do you got for number 4? To establish a uniform Russian culture. Remember, we talked about this idea of nationalism, right? I have pride in my country. I want to see my country be strong. So one of the things that people did in response to that ideology, that set of ideas, is they believe that a strong nation means everyone in the nation is the same. Because if everyone's the same, there'll be no civil war, no conflict, we'll all be united together. So if you have a place where there's a small group that's different, oftentimes the majority group says, oh, they're different, they're not going to go along with us, it's going to cause conflict, so we have to get rid of them. That was what the Nazis did in Nazi Germany, right? Oh, the Jews are not like the Nazis. They're not like Aryan Germans. They have to go. They're going to get in the way of our goals. Russia did the same thing. We're not talking about death camps and gas chambers just yet, but they did some sketchy things to Jewish people to get them to leave because they wanted Russia to be a country just for, quote, Russian people, right? Russian culture, the Russian nation. They thought that would make them stronger. Kind of sketchy, right? Do we see any long-lasting, enduring problems in this reading? Problems that people have always been dealing with. Abuse of power, right? When the government censors people and tries to eliminate a group of people with its power, I'd say it's an abuse of its position. Inequality, right? Jews were not being treated equal to other Russian people. Excellent. Conflict, perhaps, between Jews and Russians. How about one more? A word you might use for when a group of people are being picked on for being different. See it all throughout history. Okay, yeah, in this case, you're not that you're wrong, but I wouldn't use racism in this case because, remember, Judaism is not, in this context, is not going to be considered a race. It's going to be considered just a different religion, right? If you were to put a Russian Jew and a Christian Jew next to each other, you're not going to say, oh, one's a different race. They look exactly the same. It's just based purely on religion. So another word for when I'm picking on just a group of people for being different. I would use the word discrimination as the enduring issue in this case. I'll put prejudice as well. That's the other word I was thinking of, right? If you're prejudiced against a group of people for being different, that's something, unfortunately, we see in a lot of human history. It's still with us. Next, section 2, Russia industrializes. We're just going to do a couple more and then we'll call it a day. But maybe someone could remind me what it means to industrialize. We've been talking about it all year. You're using factories to produce things instead of machines, right? And if you produce things in a factory, you can produce them quickly and cheaply. Okay, so when Britain goes through an industrial revolution, it's in the 1700s and 1800s. Russia was not doing that. They stuck to old school economics. They made things by hand. They spent time farming instead of building. So they're trying to catch up. How did industrialization change Russia when they start finally catching up? Okay, had growth of heavy industry. And if you're wondering what that means, heavy industry means production, I'll give you an example, of materials like steel. Metals, basically, that you can use to build other things. What else? Okay, taxes went up. I know this is kind of weird, but like the reading says Russia lagged behind the rest of Europe. While the United States and Britain and France and Germany have factories, Russia didn't. So the government decided the government's going to raise people's taxes, take the money, and then the government will build the factories. That's not how that works in this country, right? The government doesn't do that. You decide on your own. Oh, I want to open up a business selling electric cars. My name is Elon. I'm going to open up a factory and I'm going to make the money. Okay, that's not how it worked in Russia. It's kind of the opposite in Russia. Why are people unhappy with Russia now having factories? Same answer could apply to the British. Low wages, poor working conditions, and maybe there's a group of people working in the factories that we don't like working in the factory. Yeah, child labor. Same stuff that occurred in Britain is now occurring in Russia. So some people decide that we need change, right? The British eventually passed changes. They passed reforms, right? Laws saying, get the kids out of the factories, give the people minimum wage. They weren't doing that in Russia, right? They had an absolute leader who made all the decisions, and he only cared about himself. It was different in Britain because you could put pressure on the politicians. You could say, hey, pass these reforms or I'm voting you out of office. That's how it works in a democracy. It's not going to work that way here. So people are thinking more drastically about more radical change. Some people suggested this, a dictatorship of the proletariat. What does this mean? Okay, factory workers would rule the country and government. People said, hey, maybe that Karl Marx guy had it all right. Maybe the workers who are being treated unfairly should rise up and overthrow the business owners and overthrow the government and run everything. And since the factory workers know what it means to suffer, once they're the ones in power, they will treat everybody with respect and make everything nice and equal out of the goodness of their hearts. I'm sure it worked out just like that, right? We'll talk more about that in a second. Some of those people who had that radical idea that the workers should have a revolution were the Bolsheviks. Who were these people? Yeah, people who supported revolution to accomplish their goals. Your answer might be a little bit different, but that's fine, okay? They wanted radical change, and they supported revolution to get those things done. They're not just going to go and petition the government and ask for changes. They're going to rise up. Who was the guy, his name is right there, who was the leader of this group? Good old Uncle Vlad. Vladimir. I know his last name was Ulanov in the reading, but he gave himself a new name. Okay, we're always going to use Vladimir Lenin as the guy's name. Vladimir Lenin. Crises, plural, at home and abroad. Abroad meaning overseas. So Russia, remember, like we just said, was behind the times. Japan, however, was not. Does anyone remember the name of that period of Japanese history where they start to modernize? Hashtag Regions Review. Outstanding. The Meiji Restoration, right? Japan modernizes. Japan went to war against Russia in 1904. Russia just starts industrializing in the early 1900s. Okay? And what happens is the two sides go to war. The biggest country on the planet, Russia, went to war against a couple of islands, Japan. And Japan beat the Russians. Huge slap in the face for Russia. So how do you think people start to view the leader of their government if that country is getting its butt kicked by a tiny little country? Yeah, people thought that the Tsar was weak and lost faith in the Tsar. Same thing happened with China. Remember when Britain and China had the Opium War? China has the most people in that country than any other country, but they lost to the British. So then revolutions broke out, right? The Boxer Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, because they thought that the government was weak. We need a new government that could actually make the country modern so that it doesn't lose these conflicts. So people lose faith in the Tsar. They want more change. So one day, a group of people start to demand their change. They make a petition. They walk to the Tsar's house with that petition. They ask for very simple things. They want minimum wage. They want shorter hours, better conditions, the right to vote. The Tsar was not there, but the Tsar's troops shot down all the people with that petition. It was referred to in history as Bloody Sunday. What led to this event? Okay, people did not have freedoms and lost faith in the Tsar. We don't like our government anymore. We don't have any freedom. This is unacceptable. But I'll show you the document, right? They weren't threatening, as you'll see. They went about it in a very peaceful way. So it's a shame that they all lost their lives in the process. So, in effect, what happened to those people? Okay, led to strikes and violence among Russian people. Okay, so the people that were doing the protest, they got killed. And people aren't going to sit back and go, oh, okay, I guess we're going to stop protesting for freedom now when that happens, right? That doesn't end protest and violence. That just escalates it. People get more and more agitated, demanding more and more from their Tsar. Okay, yeah, we should add that as well. The protesters were shot down by the Tsar's security guards. All right, so we got to put it all together, right? Russia is not modern. It's still behind the rest of the industrialized countries, and now it's involved in World War I. It gets its butt kicked very badly in World War I. Millions of Russians die, way more than many other countries that participated. So since the Tsar dragged this behind the times country into the war and didn't do so well, how do you think people start to feel about their government when they start to get their butts kicked in World War I? Okay, people held the Tsar responsible for Russia losing in World War I. Can we add anything to that? Yes, Tsar is an incapable ruler, meaning cannot do the job correctly, right? People lost faith. It's important to try to make comparisons when you can, right? When the Chinese lost the Opium War, people lost faith in the Chinese government. Like, how can you let this situation unfold? We have millions and millions of people here, and we let the British beat us. It led to revolution, replacing that government with a more modern government. The same thing's going to happen in Russia. They get slapped in the face against Japan. They're getting slapped in the face by the Germans in World War I. People have enough. They replace that government with one that they think will be more modern and stronger. And it will be. It will be. Russia will become the other superpower after World War II, just like the United States. Okay, way more modern than it was during World War I times. So number 14 is referring to an individual called Rasputin. And if you looked at the reading, Rasputin was this... it's hard to kind of sum Rasputin up in like just a minute or so, but he worked for the church. He claimed to have all kinds of superpowers, and he became friends with the royal family. And the royal family had a son who desperately needed medical care. Do you happen to catch what disease the Tsar's son had? Hemophilia. Do you guys know what hemophilia is? It's like you can't stop bleeding. Like if someone just does this to you, you will start bleeding internally, and if you can't stop it, you will die. So you have to live a very like bubble boy kind of existence. You wrap yourself up in like, you know, bubble wrap and just lay down and don't move. So this person came in, this Rasputin guy, and the royal family was claiming that, oh, this mythical being is at our house and he's treating the kid and he's doing better now. And what happens is the Tsar, he goes to fight World War I. He leads troops on the battlefield, and all that's left behind is the Tsarina. And people are thinking, oh, this Rasputin character, he's having an affair with the princess. They're letting these mythical beings have a role in the government. It's a conspiracy. It's not good for the country. We want him gone. So this question here was kind of tough. You had to make an inference. This Rasputin guy had a lot of influence over the policies of Russia. Why do you think the Tsar and the Tsar's family gave this guy so much leeway and power? Okay, that thought he had the power to cure the son. Right? We tend to value, right, in our modern culture, like things like separation of church and state. Right? So like that's our attitude, right? So imagine all of a sudden we have like religious leaders going to the White House, right? Disappearing for times. You're gonna wonder, like, what's going on behind the scenes there? Like, is the religion taking over the country? What exactly is happening here? So it's more fuel for the fire of why people don't trust the government. Big picture stuff. If this interests you at all, there's a great series on Netflix called The Last Tsar, where you really get a good sense of what Rasputin was like and all the controversy. It's not a documentary; it's a TV show, and a lot of R-rated stuff that I know you guys like. Otherwise, I would show it in class because it's pretty awesome. But we'll move on for now to the last part here, the March Revolution. Just like France had multiple phases of the French Revolution, same thing with the Russian Revolution, multiple phases. The first phase is the March one. What happened to the Tsar as a result of a revolution in March of 1917? Yeah, forced to give up his power. And we have a fancy word for that, abdicate. To abdicate means you're giving up your power. So you've got strikes happening in the streets. Soldiers are protesting, deserting the army. Everything is a hot mess. And the Tsar's like, if I continue staying here, they will come after me. They will kill me. So he says, fine, I'll step down. I'll let the people elect new leadership, and maybe, you know, they'll let me live. That was the hope. So they put a new government in power consisting of elected officials. The guy that was in charge of this provisional government, the word provisional means temporary, is this guy, Alexander Kerensky. He makes some reforms, meaning changes, but he makes one crucial error that really, really was unpopular. Okay, he kept Russia in World War I. The people wanted Russia out of the war. They were losing badly. Millions of people were dying. But this new government comes into play, and they kept Russia in the war. And that's kind of a tough thing, right? It seems like an easy thing to do. Oh, why don't you just make peace and be done with it? But think about the consequences of that, right? That's a tough thing to just do, to surrender to your enemy, because you're going to have to give up land. You're going to have to give the Germans what they want. And if you know anything about Russia, let me just show you a map for a second of Russia. The most important stuff in Russia, one can make the case, is on the left-hand side. This is not the most ideal map, but the big cities of Russia, like St. Petersburg, the capital city of Moscow, are all on the left-hand side. You can see on this map too, Ukraine. Hard to see, I'll circle it. Ukraine's right here. Today it's a modern independent country, but back in the day, that was part of Russia. It's part of the reason, that's part of maybe the justification, if you will, of why Putin wants to take it back over, because historically, that was Russian territory. So if Russia surrendered to Germany and left World War I, more than likely, they would have to give up all this land to Germany. That most valuable land, like the land that's on the seas, your capital city. That would not be ideal either, right? So that was a tough decision for the government to make, but they decided to try to win this thing. But the people weren't having it, right? The government officials aren't the ones that have to fight the war. It's the poor people that have to go fight the war. And they weren't having it anymore. So people are, again, losing faith in this new government. They lost faith in the Tsar, forced him to step down. They're losing faith in Kerensky and his temporary government, and they start saying, we want to take power for ourselves. hence the term Soviets. What are Soviets? Consisting of workers, peasants, I'm just going to add soldiers to that. Do you guys remember, just to make a comparison, to make things more clear and understandable, do you remember, going back to the French Revolution, what we called the group of people that were like the commoners and poor? Which estate was that? Third estate. What did the third estate do when they were tired of the king, right? One day they called themselves something and they said, we're the ones in charge of France now. And if you have a problem with that, you could try to come after us. Do you remember what they called themselves as this new governing body of France? We declare ourselves the National Assembly. Third estate just said, you know what? That government doesn't exist anymore. We're in charge now. This is the Russian version of that. That people said, this government that kept us in the war, we're not listening to it anymore. Instead, every community will have its own elected officials and we'll run ourselves. And if they call us up, they draft us to go fight the war, we just won't go. We won't pay the taxes. We will run ourselves separately. That's an act of defiance. That is an act of revolution. And little by little, these local communities would have more authority and more loyalty among the people than the actual government of the country, right? That would be like us in this classroom claiming, oh, Farmingville, we're the governing body of Farmingville. And if the United States government has a problem with that, they can come after us, right? Maybe we go out into the Farmingville community and we make promises to people and we try to keep them, right? We'll get people jobs. We repave the streets. If we do stuff like that, we would get people on our side. That's what a Soviet was, a small group of people who took power over local communities and built loyalty among the locals. Okay, next. So what we're going to do in a second is, and I'm going to show you how this is going to work so you're not confused. We're going to go through the worksheet that we just completed, figure out what the problems are, and then put the problems in the right spot. Because it's these problems that are going to lead to the Russian Revolution. We're looking to break down the different types of causes for why there was an uprising in the Soviet Union. In Russia. So for example, if we go down to section 1, the czars resist change, number 1 here is significant. Can somebody remind me really quick? What is autocracy? Form of government in which one person has all the power. Does that sound like something that the Russian people would be upset about? Yeah, right, because you don't have political freedom. You don't have the right to vote. This is a long-term cause for why there was revolution. That idea of the government having all the power, which category do you think that belongs in on this chart? Social means people stuff, right? The interactions between people, rich versus poor. Economic is business stuff. Religion's religion. Military is war stuff. Where do you think autocracy goes? It's political, right? Political is government stuff. So any problem that's political, we're going to put here. So we're going to say government was an autocracy. Rule by one. So I'm going to put you with a partner. And what I want to see done is I want to see minimum 2 things in each of these boxes. So you will have to go through your activity and find things that fit the appropriate category. Find some religious problems, some economic problems, some military problems. So sometimes when you do this, you can often make a case that something belongs in 2 categories. As long as you can explain why you would put it there, that's totally fine, right? If you would like to be writing an essay about these things. Don't worry, you're not going to. But can you tell me some problems that people dealt with that might have made them upset? Okay. Anti-Semitism. And if you put that in the religion box, that's totally fine as well. Prejudice is a social problem. 100% agreed. Anything else? Large gap between the rich and the poor. Something Karl Marx was warning about, that if that's allowed to continue, poor people, because there's more of them than the rich people, they're going to rise up and take what they want, just like they did during the French Revolution. Anything else? Okay. Violence between people. Strikes. Right? All the Russians are bowling, throwing the ball really fast because they're Russian. Very good. That'll do for social. How about another political one? We've got autocratic rule of the czar, another government problem, perhaps? Meg? Censorship. To block out, right? The government restricts your access to certain information, like a curse word on TV, like a curse word on the radio, like knowing about the degree of the severity of the Spanish flu, right? That's censorship. Absolutely. Anything else for political? Did people have faith in the czar anymore or not so much? No. So I will put people lost faith in the czar. That's a political problem, right? Losing faith in one's government, lack of trust in the government. And there was a political problem with regards to the provisional government, they made a key mistake that made people even more upset. We just said it a couple of minutes ago. Exactly. They didn't pull the people out of World War I, right? So I'm going to say provisional government kept Russia in World War I. Some political problems. Again, I only asked you for 2, but be thorough. Add stuff here if necessary. Bloody Sunday. Yeah, you can make a case that's political. If I were to ask you to make a case for it, why would you put this for political? Okay, right? It's the government that people were asking things from, and it's the government that killed the people, right? Or people who worked for the government, I should say. So good call. Very good. Let's move to economic. Okay, let's talk about that word. Because industrialization on the surface sounds like a good thing. But Russia had a problem with regards to its industrialization. What was the issue? Okay, wages were really low. We'll start with that. Low wages in factories. If you wanted to make a case that that's a social issue, that's fine too, because it kind of ties into poverty. But yeah, money, economics. Okay, raising taxes. No one ever likes that. Child labor. Again, you could justify that that's a social problem. But what about when you compare Russia to the rest of the modern countries? Was Russia as modern, or were they a little bit behind the times? I'm going to say Russia lagged behind other countries in terms of industry. So in some ways they were okay. I think Russia eventually by 1917 became like the world's like 3rd most productive producer of like steel, but they didn't have a very diverse degree of industrialization, right? So a diversified economy produces a lot of things. You might be really good at producing steel, but maybe you're not producing tanks or planes or weaponry. And this came back to bite the Russians when it comes to World War I, because they would literally be sending their soldiers into battle without the weapons that they needed. Okay, that works for me. How about a religious issue? Organized violence against Jewish populations, yes. Against Russian Jews. Okay, you're going to want to be familiar with this term pogrom. It's a fancy word for that, when the government organizes violence against a group of people in the country. Right? They justified this by saying, we're going to make Russia just a country for Russian people, because if we're all the same, we'll be united, we'll be having no conflict, and that makes for a stronger country. And as a nationalist, that's what I want, right? A strong country. That's pretty sketchy though, right? Hitler will take that to the extreme during World War II with the death camps and stuff like that. Okay, finally, military. Give me some military problems Russia faced. Okay, right? Russia was losing badly in World War I, millions dead. Right, I think I showed you guys a chart when we did the Versailles lesson. The number of people who died in Russia was as much as Germany. And Russia left, right? There was a whole year of fighting that Russia did not partake in. And they still lost as many people as Germany. That should be telling. What's the other slap in the face militarily that Russia faced? Okay, not prepared good, not prepared to fight. Russia lost Russo-Japanese War. Huge slap in the face. Again, guys, Russia's the biggest country on the planet. The year was 1904. The Meiji Restoration happened like 30 years before that war. And already Japan could hand it to the Russians. That says a lot about how fast Japan industrialized, but it also shows how far behind the times Russia was, that it could lose to such a small country.